Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. The results pretty much are out in the Iranian presidential elections, where Ibrahim Raisi, the now, I would imagine, former Chief Justice of the country, has won the elections with around 62% of the votes, around, I believe it was, if I'm not mistaken, 28.9 or something along those lines, million votes were cast. 90% of the ballots at this point in time, at least according to some of the Iranian media, has been counted so far. Turnout ranges at this point in time, they're not official figures out yet, I believe, between 48 to 53% is the estimates that I'm seeing. That is a fairly low turnout in context, of course, of previous Iranian elections ever since the revolution. That will be, I would think, something that will be discussed in the coming days as well about why that may have occurred. But nevertheless, what do we know about the figure of Ibrahim Raisi? He has been in the judiciary for a significant amount of years now, so he's not a new figure within the judiciary. But what kind of a president then will he be? How different will he be from President Rouhani or even other previous presidents as well? What does this mean for most importantly, I would think, for Iranians, domestic policies such as corruption, mismanagement, the sanctions as well? Will he be able to then deal with that and deal with the United States as well as the Vienna talks in a successful fashion as well? Or will he be very tough and hard line, as some are calling him already, and that's the narrative surrounding him at this point? Let's discuss all of those issues a bit further. I'm joined with Dr. Hussein Banai, who is a professor of international studies at the Hamilton Lugar School of Global and International Studies, at Indiana University. He is joining us this morning from Indianapolis, Indiana. Joining us from Tehran is Hamidreza Gholamzadeh, who is a PhD candidate in American Studies. And also joining us from the Iranian capital is Mostapha Khoshcheshm, who is a senior Iran affairs analyst. Mostapha Khoshcheshm, Hamidreza, and Hussein, thank you to all three of you for your time today. Hussein, let me start with you. Looking from the outside in then, what do you make of the win of Raisi, and how drastically possibly this will change things for both Iranians and the rest of us?
Well, I think the most notable thing looking from outside is that this appears to be the most engineered presidential election in the 42-year history of the Islamic Republic. Engineered in a sense that the possibility for real competition was there. It was just completely constrained by the Guardian Council from the beginning. But even if you go before that, when there were rumors of the now outgoing foreign minister, Mohammad Javad Zarif, possibly running for president, there was a leaked tape of him mildly criticizing General Qasem Soleimani of the Quds Force that pretty much upended any possible hope for him running. And then, of course, you had the quite extraordinary disqualification of the longest-serving Speaker of the Majlis, Ali Larijani, who no doubt would have been a very viable competition to Raisi. And then the most extraordinary thing of all, which was the basically cold shoulder that the Guardian Council gave to the Supreme Leader himself, who raised some concerns about the vetting process of the candidates. So when you put all those things together, it's really remarkable how disciplined the hidden hands behind the screen have been in making sure that Raisi would win this presidential election. And that is something that we have not seen, as constrained as Iranian elections have been over the course of the last 42 years. This is the first time that you have this much of a brazen attempt to keep even conservative figures out of competition.
Khoshcheshm, I wanted to, of course, get your thoughts about what Hussein there just said, and I wanted to add this on, if you allow me. With the turnout numbers that we're seeing right now, the percentage, this would be the lowest turnout in any presidential election so far since the revolution. That in and of itself needs to also be studied, certainly.
We're not through with the ballot counting yet. 10% more would be added, and that would mean somewhere around 51% of eligible voters. Now, let's consider that we have had similar races in the past, like the election that brought to power for a second term the late Hashemi Rafsanjani, that was less than 51%. And also, let's remember that according to polls, all the polls by accredited polling centers and academic centers, some 9 to 11% of the people didn't appear at the polls because of the coronavirus, and it's not the only one. I mean, Iran is not the only one. A recent, I believe, Harvard research paper said that the same factor, coronavirus, left a 20% negative impact on the French election. And they are not on the sanctions. They are equipped better with the coronavirus campaign equipment. And if you add up that number, then it would be an average. But still, it's outstanding that half of the people took part in this election, despite the monarchists, the Mujahideen Khalq organization, the U.S. supported media, some Arab media in the region, Mir Hossein Mousavi, who led the 2009 unrest, Ahmadinejad, who defeated him in that election, actually. They all called for a boycott, and they failed. That's it. But with respect to my colleague, let's remember that when President Khatami rose to power, before that, nobody knew him. He was the head of the National Library, and he was a former minister. And after he presented his ideas during the election campaign, he became a reformist leader. The same is true about Ahmadinejad, who was just a mayor. He was not in the news. And then after he took part in the election, nobody counted on him back then. But he became famous after winning the election. Again, the same was true about Rouhani, who headed the research center at the Expediency Council of Iran. Yeah. And in the words of late Hashemi Rafsanjani, he could garner no more than 3% of the vote if it hadn't been for late Hashemi Rafsanjani. So what I'm telling you is that Mr. Hemmeti, who's a governor of the central bank, at least he was in the media in the past 2-3 years. He was better known. Yeah. The reformists and those that called for the boycotts, these two groups, they need to understand two important facts. Those that called for the boycotts, hoping that no more than 20-25% would appear at the polls, failed totally. And then the reformists should realize that people are angry with them. Some of them didn't take part in the election. Others voted for Raisi because they have realized that the reformist campaign slogans never came true, and they've been deceived by the reformist campaign.
Okay, I'm going to come in here. Just wanted to, if you allow me, go to Hamidreza as well. Hamidreza, Mostapha, Khoshcheshm, and Hussein both made some very good points there, and I wanted to get your thoughts on those and add this on, if I may. Will Ibrahim Raisi be able to unite even those Iranians who did not support him and or even boycotted these elections? I mean, it still seems that his figure is not one that seems very uniting, at least at this point today.
I would like to follow actually what Mr. Khoshcheshm was saying and ask to him that the problem with the reformist camp is that they want to play a blame game and blame the others, the Guardian Council, the establishment, and the principalists, anyone else except for themselves, for the mistakes that they have made and for the failures that they have made actually during several elections. Last night, Behdad Nabavi, which is a key thinker among the reformists, and he has been a strategist for so long, admitted that they have had made many mistakes for years. For example, for the first time, 2005, that they introduced Mostapha Moin. He was a bad pick, and even during other elections. The point is that the reformists didn't have anyone to run for the race. They didn't introduce any acceptable, strong face to the election. And among those who registered for the candidacy, there were just two main figures that we can pay attention to. One was Mr. Jahangiri, who is currently vice president, and the other one was Ali Larijani, former parliament speaker, as Hussein just mentioned his name. But Larijani, we know that is not a reformist. He just had close relationships with President Rouhani's administration, who himself is not accepted as a reformist by many radical reformists in Iran. And Jahangiri was the emblem, the totem, and the epitome of the current status quo, and the only difficulties that Rouhani's administration has created for the country. So he had no vote among the public. That is the problem, that the lower turnout, the the position that the people had toward the reformists is because they did not trust the reformists anymore. And actually, people, in answer to your second question,
sure, people
voted pragmatically, we can say, in this round, and they did not buy social slogans, liberty, internet freedom, and such things, and they voted for pragmatic plans. And because of that, I think that Mr. Raisi would work for a national unity, and he's going to use some reformist figures, I guess. Like, for example, if I want to guess, like, for example, Vice President for Scientific Affairs, Soran Satori, can be a figure who will remain in place. Or maybe, for example, people like Salehi, head of Atomic Energy Organization of Iran.
All right. If you allow me, I wanted to go to Hussein, and I wanted to put this as a final question, Hussein, about the legacy right here of Rouhani, and I wanted to bring in a foreign policy angle on this, because certainly, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but looking from the outside, and I was in Iran, especially when the deal as well was signed, it seemed that Rouhani was almost like a one-issue president, right? It was about the nuclear deal, and little else was his concentration, at least at the time of the nuclear deal and surrounding that. Do you think that that was a mistake, that was done badly, and that is why possibly at least one of the explanations of what we've seen happen over the past 24 hours and at the major defeat of the reformists at the polls?
Yeah, I think the nuclear issue certainly was a centerpiece, but much more than that. I think that Rouhani administration even went beyond the nuclear issue being the single issue. I mean, the emblem of his campaign in 2013 was the key. He was going to be the key that solves all of the Islamic Republic's problems. And that's a fairly high bar to set. So you're inevitably setting yourself up for failure, because the enormity of the challenges that any nation state faces, let alone one that is under sanctions and is very much cut off from the world economic flows, it's going to be too massive for anyone to completely solve them. So failure was very much cooked in the Rouhani messaging of all this. But I think much more than that, the public is very aware that Rouhani's presidency was somewhat of a compromise. If you remember, he came into office being a last-minute compromise candidate after the former president Hashemi Rafsanjani basically became very clear he would not be qualified to run. And so we go back to the central point, which is a structural issue that I raised. I don't have any problems with what the other guests said about, the appeal of this faction or that faction or their problems of messaging, et cetera. It comes down to this point that fairly conservative figures were kept out of this race to contest it, and Larijani obviously being one of them. And that tightening of control by the Guardian Council is, I think, the most notable thing coming out of this election, much more than what Raisi would do or whether the failures of the past set his election up or not. The issue here is that this was a tightly controlled election.
Okay, Mostapha Khoshcheshm, let's move beyond just the election itself and how it was conducted, and let's talk about Raisi and what you think, what kind of an impact do you think he will have, right? So he has spoken a lot about, or enough times, in fact, about a fight against corruption and mismanagement, saying that he will be very, hard-handed about that and will punish those who are corrupt and or mismanage the country's finances. Will he be able to succeed in that regard, right? Because we talk a lot about sanctions, and that is certainly a legitimate discussion. But I want to move away from that just for a moment and just talk about the corruption and mismanagement. Will Raisi be the man to be able to properly deal with those issues?
Of the Iranian people who have voted for Raisi disagree with views of my friend from Indianapolis, or from the United States anyway. And if it hadn't been for the coronavirus, some 62% of the people eligible to vote would have rejected him outright, which is a good normal for Iran. It seems that my friend doesn't have a good sense of the choice of the people in here, because they have voted, they've given a landslide victory to Raisi, and that means an expression of their views. Of course, they were fed up with Rouhani. Rouhani put all his eggs in one basket of removing the sanctions through the JCPOA and improve economy, and he failed repeatedly. He never relied on developing domestic capabilities. That's exactly what his critics, including the revolutionaries, mainly Raisi, president-elect now, of course, he was saying right from the beginning that, okay, you could go ahead with the negotiation, but you need to also develop the domestic economic potentials. And that's exactly his plan. Raisi is not a radical, illogical person to just rely on domestic capabilities and ignore other instruments that he might have. He would continue, of course, the JCPOA if it's revived under Rouhani. Otherwise, he would continue negotiations, but negotiation would not be the only instrument that he would rely on. He would most probably go ahead with the strategy that the revolutionary camp has devised. That's a manifesto that says, in addition to negotiations, you need to diffuse the United States sanctions and lower their impacts. Okay. At the same time, you need to increase the leverage on the United States. And, of course, to do that, you need to develop your own domestic economic capabilities, expand ties with the neighbors.
Okay, it seems we have a connection there with Mostapha Khoshcheshm. I'll go to you, Hamidreza. If you wanted to continue on Mr. Khoshcheshm's thoughts, certainly I'll allow you to do that. But I also wanted to add this on again about the corruption and mismanagement within the country, as Mr. Khoshcheshm there was mentioning. There is also an argument when it comes to the Rouhani administration. I know from my years in the country as well that when he opened up the country right after the deal, that there was then almost this lack of investment or lack of concentration on domestic industries and the domestic abilities and self-sufficiency, if that's the correct term. Do you think that we'll now go back to concentrating on that under a Raisi administration?
With the economy as the highest priority issue on the agenda for Raisi's government or anyone else who would win the election, he would focus mainly on that and expect that the foreign policy issues like, for example, nuclear talks and important cases would transfer from foreign ministry to Supreme Council for National Security, and the government would focus on domestic issues, domestic politics, to unite people and reduce polarity in the society, to fix the economy, to invest on production, agriculture, industry, creation of jobs and creation of houses, to actually ease the problem with the housing and to give the youth actually chances and opportunity to have better economy, to get married and form their family and such things that are major social and economic problems for the society. So I expect that his government would focus on these domestic issues, and foreign ministry is going to play less role in the future, and the majority of the issues would be on Supreme National Security Council, as it was before President Rouhani during Ahmadinejad's administration, and when Jalili was actually secretary of that Supreme Council, and he was responsible for negotiations. So I expect that would be like that. And of course, with this economic agenda that Raisi is going to have, he needs to continue the same anti-corruption agenda and to fight against corruption, because it is something that people are demanding strongly.
Hussein, we just have a minute and a half left, so I want to give you the final word. Raisi is also and has been sanctioned for a number of years now by the United States as well, and that's regarding human rights issues. Will that be a stumbling block in his path, be it when it comes to domestic policy making, such as dealing with the economy, et cetera, and especially then when foreign policy making?
I think so. It would be a tricky thing to deal with, especially when it comes to Western powers and negotiations. I expect that calls about human rights record of Mr. Raisi, bringing greater awareness to it in Western capitals, will expedite exponentially over the course of the next few weeks, and people will become much better acquainted with his record, especially in the dark first decade after the revolution, where he was on the so-called death commission. that sent something approximately like 5,000 political prisoners to their deaths. And all of those issues will be raised. There will be a lot of pressure to not deal with them directly. But I think at the end of the day, there are practical issues with Iran to be solved. And on the foreign policy front, obviously, the nuclear portfolio is the main one. We'll see if a deal comes out in the interim before he's sworn in as president, and if that will be the case, whether that will be it in terms of furthering relations with Iran. I expect that to be the case, given the hardline rhetoric that Raisi has used during the campaign and before, but not much beyond that. I should say one last word that Iran has always had a unified foreign policy decision-making apparatus. As your other guest pointed out, these decisions will be made in committees in the Supreme National Security Council, for instance, and obviously would have to be approved by the Office of the Supreme Leader as well. So I don't expect there to be a sharp change in Iran's foreign policy under Raisi, just a different rhetoric, different management of relations.
We'll leave it there at that, but we really appreciate Hussein, Hamidreza, and Mostapha for taking their time out. I know it's a busy time for all of them, especially considering the results have come out today with Ibrahim Raisi now winning the Iranian presidential election. We were able to contextualize, right? Because we hear a lot in the media about Iran, and as with many countries around the world, there's a lot of narratives around Iran, but it's good to speak to, of course, people on the ground, those who are experts in Iran and have context in Iran to understand the real context of what's happening in reality. What will Raisi be able to achieve? Will he be able to overcome the many stumbling blocks in his path, which are already there even before he became president? He has now won with, a 60% odd mandate at this point in time, with 90% of the ballots counted. I believe that number will probably go higher. Turnout is not as bad as we were made to believe, if we are to believe some of the estimates right now about turnout. But of course, all those final numbers will need to come out soon, when they do, by the Election Commission of Iran. There's a lot on the table. There's a lot of challenges that Raisi has to deal with. Will he be able to unite also the country behind him, especially those who did choose to boycott these elections, did choose to be, cut off essentially in some ways from this specific campaign that was run by all the candidates? We'll keep a close eye on that, of course, here in Scope. I'll be back with the next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now, one of the things that's not been in the news for a while is the issue on the Korean Peninsula, of course, and that had picked up pace during Donald Trump and during his tenure, especially when he had reached out to Kim Jong-un, the North Korean leader, and in fact had even met him a few times. That, though, did not lead anywhere. There was no complete resolution to the issue between the two nations and bringing the North Koreans back into the international fold, so to speak, and/or lifting sanctions, etc. We now have a new statement by Kim Jong-un speaking about how his country needs to be prepared for both dialogue and confrontation with this new administration, that is the administration of Joe Biden in the United States. What exactly is the North Korean game plan here at this point in time? And secondly, what is then the American game plan as well, considering it seems that Biden will also be seemingly continuing that pivot to Asia tactic that Barack Obama had begun under his presidency. Let's discuss all of this a bit further. And I'm joined by Dr. Edward Howell, who is a stipendiary lecturer of politics at the New College at the University of Oxford. He's joining us today from Oxford in the UK. Edward, thank you very much for your time today. Dialogue and confrontation. I mean, how does that work exactly? I imagine this just means it's a cautionary approach on the part of the North Koreans?
Hello, thank you very much for having me. It's interesting when we talk about what the North Koreans want, dialogue and confrontation. At first, it may seem a bit of a paradox. It may seem a little bit ironic. But actually, it seems perfectly in keeping with the rhetoric that Kim has been expounding, particularly since the tail end of the Trump administration, but also as Biden has took hold. Dialogue and confrontation. North Korea is not closing the door to dialogue completely, but it's also not closing the door to confrontation. I think we need to move beyond thinking about dialogue and confrontation as sort of mutually exclusive. Because at least from North Korea's perspective, confrontation, whether that's in terms of rhetorical discourse, words, provocations in that front, but also in terms of behaviors pertaining to such a short-range missile test, which we did see earlier this year, is, in North Korea's view, a way of getting dialogue. Confrontation, whether that's directly towards the US or to South Korea, is a way for North Korea feels it will be able to reach out to the US and get some form of negotiation with the US, right, because this is what we've seen in the past. When North Korea has confronted, the US has reached out to North Korea, or South Korea for that matter, to the negotiating table.
Yeah, I mentioned Trump in my introduction because Trump did something which I don't think any other U.S. president would have ever thought of doing, and that was meeting Kim Jong-un, right? And I know that there's a debate about whether or not he should have done that and given Kim Jong-un the opportunity for that sort of PR and, public campaign to present himself as, a genuine leader, legitimate leader, et cetera. That's also problematic in the international eyes for some people. But then at least he did something different. I mean, I feel like, do you think Biden may just go back to the status quo where it'll just be very behind the scenes, very offhands almost, at least to the public eye, about what's really happening with North Korea and any talk with it?
I think what's important to bear in mind is that, yes, Trump's policy was unprecedented, and yes, there were concerns, as you mentioned, about legitimizing the North Korean regime from North Korea's perspective as well. However, with the Biden administration, there are concerns that the Biden administration's policy will revert back to the so-called strategic patience approach as pursued by the Obama administration, where basically the Obama administration said that they would only make political concessions and engage with North Korea if North Korea took the first move towards denuclearization. Now, with Biden, yes, this is a concern, but a couple of things highlight that it may not be too much of a concern. I think firstly, we've got to remember that the Biden administration's recent North Korea policy review, whilst it was quite concise and hasn't revealed very much as of yet, highlighted this idea of diplomacy and stern deterrence. So yes, we're seeing the Biden administration pursue an approach where it will engage if it feels North Korea is willing and North Korea is willing to compromise, and it will not if North Korea isn't. But also we've got to remember that Biden's team in his administration, particularly those with responsibility for the East Asia and Pacific, specifically North Korea, comprises a lot of experienced veteran diplomats and negotiators who have negotiated with North Korea in the past, particularly during the Obama administration, but also going back further in the Clinton administration. So we have a group of highly experienced veteran diplomats who understand what it's like to negotiate with North Korea. They understand the issues that can arise from past experience. And so this may assuage some of the fears of the international community and also within the US that the Biden administration's approach is merely going to be a reversion back to the status quo ante. I think we should be cautious at the moment of coming to any judgment. As of yet, the North Korea policy review has only recently come out.
All right, so let's talk about the Korean factor in all this, right? Edward, Moon Jae-in had put his, also, I would imagine, political legacy on the line when he wanted to have better relations with the North Koreans as well, right? And I know that he was criticized for that even within South Korea as well, about that more pacifist, if that's the right term, probably an overstatement, approach of his. Do you think that the South Korean approach will also change at some point now? Because it does seem that even the North Koreans seemingly have calmed down just of recent when it comes to weapons tests, et cetera. Also, so it seems like we're almost at a stalemate, but then, I mean, this can technically go both ways still.
I think, firstly, we must remember that North Korea self-imposed a moratorium on long-range missile tests ICBM launches, and nuclear tests. And so, obviously, it's up to them to decide whether they revert back to such provocations. Secondly, though, with regards to the Moon Jae-in administration, yes, Moon pursued a policy of rapprochement, inter-Korean economic and political cooperation. Okay, and it's important to state that it was both political reconciliation, but also Moon's agenda, at least initially, and we saw this from his pre-election campaign as well, was very much focused on economic projects. Now, Moon's efforts have unfortunately not borne fruit. We've seen difficulties, not least on the part of, yes, as you mentioned, conflict within South Korea, conflicting opinion, but also pertaining to issues with respect to North Korea. North Korea has, as of earlier this year, shunned any sort of back-channel dialogue with the US and South Korea. And we've also seen earlier last year, around this time last year, North Korea engage in a clear act of provocation by demolishing the Inter-Korean Liaison Office, which was a de facto embassy in Kaesong, on the border between North and South Korea. That was established as a result of the Panmunjom Declaration, which arose following a meeting between Moon Jae-in and Kim Jong-un in April 2018. I think a final point to note regarding Moon Jae-in's policy is, okay, yes, South Korea needs to maintain its strong alliance with the US on the one hand, and and Biden has very much affirmed this with Moon's recent visit and summit with Biden.
Yeah.
But also, on the other hand, Moon does not have much time left in power. And so, as he has only a few months left, an 11th hour deal is very unlikely. And so we'll have to wait and see with regards to the new South Korean administration as to what their policy towards North Korea will be, because that will also affect the Biden administration's response and also, importantly, North Korea's behavior. I think we mustn't forget that North Korea is also part of the problem here.
Of course. Definitely. We'll leave there at that. Unfortunately, Edward, the clock has gotten the best of us. We really, really appreciate you taking your time on this Saturday to speak to us. We were discussing there Kim Jong-un's statement, talking about both dialogue and confrontation, as Edward there was able to brilliantly contextualize for us. To the rest of us, this may seem like a paradox, like a paradoxical statement, but it's not, in fact, paradoxical if we're looking at North Korean statements in the past and just the situation as a whole. It's always sort of followed this dual track approach where there's dialogue, confrontation. It's always a cause and effect situation. We'll keep a close eye on that, of course, because we do now have certainly Biden in office, and he's finding his place now in office, and he's now also appointed U.S. envoy for North Korea, Sung Kim, and we'll have to keep a close eye on how that envoy is able to then carry out their work at this point in time. I'll be back with my final segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here on Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now, in this final segment of today's show, we're going to discuss a report that's come out, a disturbing one, by the Associated Press, that U.S. military guns have vanished. A large number of them have vanished. In context, of course, we're talking about around 1,900 U.S. military firearms that were stolen or lost in the 2010s. And some have now begun resurfacing in crimes, street crimes, that we're seeing within America itself. And there seems to have also then been an effort to downplay this, again, according to this report and this investigation that AP carried out. What does that say in and of itself? Because it's one thing for this to have happened, i.e. Stolen weapons, and it's quite another to then downplay this and try to almost cover it up if that is what happened, as the investigation says. Let's discuss that a bit further. I'm joined by Dr. Grant Davis-Reeher, who is a professor of political science and director of the Campbell Public Affairs Institute at Syracuse University's Maxwell School of Citizenship. He's joining us this morning from Syracuse, New York. Grant, good morning, and thank you for joining us today. I would imagine, of course, it is disturbing just in and of itself that 1,900 firearms were stolen or lost from the U.S. military, from its various infrastructure and sites across the U.S. itself. But then it's quite another to then try to cover that up, isn't it?
Well, I think the second thing that you raise is really the more concerning one. Let's put the first piece in context. So 1,900 weapons lost over a 10-year period. In the United States, in civilian hands right now, there are 350 million firearms and counting. We're in a buying surge right now in the United States when it comes to firearms. And when you think about the number of guns that the military deals with, I mean, they order them by the millions. And so I don't mean to discount the danger that 1,900 military firearms getting into the hands of civilians might pose. But it really, in context, is I think, a somewhat small number. The more disturbing aspect is the second thing that you bring up, is that the military and the government has been quite guarded and shielded about sharing information about this. And so I think this is really more a story about government transparency than about public safety, really, in the end.
Yeah, you're right. I agree with you on the transparency issue. And I wonder, if God forbid, one of these weapons were to then be used in a mass shooting. I'm just throwing out words here and events here that possibly could have happened. And there are always, unfortunately, incidents that are happening across the U.S. every so often at smaller scales. If it was one of these weapons that was used, that would then create this domino effect, right? About then who is really responsible. Obviously, the perpetrator himself or herself, but then how exactly that person would have gotten those weapons. I mean, do you think that there is now, this report has come out, that there will be proper then investigation done and hopefully those weapons recovered?
Well, I think those weapons are probably lost from any kind of recovery effort once they get into the black market. But again, let's put this in context. There are 8 civilian shootings that we know of where these guns have been involved. That's 8 over a 10-year period. There are about 14,000 gun homicides every year. And even more shootings, of course, than the number of homicides. What's more concerning to me from a public safety standpoint is that included in some of these missing weapons were explosives and armor-piercing grenades that I believe can be fired from a grenade launcher. That is a much more significant, I think, concern for public safety. And so that is something that personally I would like to learn more about when it comes to tracing these guns that were lost or stolen, or the weapons, I should say, that were lost or stolen.
Then there's also then the issue of where these weapons were stolen from, right? So the safety and security of those sites where these weapons are stored. And even today, I mean, of course, I would imagine the U.S. has those weapons at these sites stored as well, or even more advanced ones. Do you think that probably has been properly dealt with, that issue in and of itself? Because that's not very comforting either, right? Knowing that these can be stolen from those sites.
Well, this is not what your story's on, but the big thing that I worry about, both as a citizen and a political scientist, is the security of weapons of mass destruction. But I imagine that internally there have been some changes that are in the process of being made as a result of this AP report. Unfortunately, it took a press report in order to, if this is the case, in order to strengthen those security protocols. But again, given the number of weapons that the military deals with, it's not surprising to me that this number is unaccounted for or have been lost or stolen. But again, I think it's more an issue of transparency and certainly an issue of understanding, and the public has a right to know, understanding what new protocols are being taken in light of the fact that they've had these problems.
Just before I let you go, Grant, I wanted to ask you, I know it's a very heavy question, but what are your thoughts overall just about all these weapons in people's hands to begin with? So we're moving beyond just this specific story, and you mentioned the number at the beginning. And, for a lot of us on the outside, of course, the United States is a huge country, so we're not expecting there to be very few weapons in people's hands, but it's just that number boggles the mind, and one wonders that in and of itself, just so many weapons out there in people's hands, is in and of itself a risk as well.
Well, yes, in general, certainly it is the major contributing factor to some of our homicide rates in the United States, particularly, again, thinking about the 14,000 gun homicides or so. But what needs to be kept in mind here is that, first of all, the majority of gun violence in this country and the majority of homicides with firearms in this country are done with handguns. More people are beaten to death and stabbed to death than they are killed by rifles. And that includes mass shootings. And so that needs to be borne in mind. The second thing that needs to be borne in mind is that the majority of gun deaths in the United States are suicides, not homicides. And so when we think about interventions to lower the level of gun violence and gun death in this country, we have to think about mental health, we have to think about suicides, and then we need to think about handguns. And most of those handguns and homicides are used in poorer, disadvantaged areas of cities, by and large, and a lot of it concerns gang violence. And so anti-gang initiatives and anti-gang violence initiatives are critically important if we're thinking about trying to lower gun deaths.
We'll leave it there at that, Grant, but we really appreciate, again, you taking your time out this morning to share your insight with us and your expertise. That was Grant Davis Reeher speaking to us there from Syracuse, New York. This morning we were discussing this disturbing report. As Grant there, of course, correctly pointed out, the context is the 1,900 even military firearms as compared to the millions of such weapons possibly in the hands of the average American is not a huge number, but the bigger story really is about government transparency, as he alluded to and spoke of. And that then is the crux of the matter, isn't it? Why would the government and military try to cover this up? I mean, they probably have hopefully put in more stringent security measures at the sites that these weapons were stolen from. But just the fact that one cannot be transparent about something so important, because I mean, this could have been possibly a lot worse, right? And just that thought of that is quite disturbing, I would think, for the average American as well. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.